The winter of 1945 brought with it the unmistakable sense of impending doom for German forces across the European theatre. As Allied armies pressed inward from all directions, the once mighty Wehrmacht found itself fracturing under the relentless pressure. For the artillerymen of Battery D, 177th Artillery Regiment, positioned along the western approaches to the Rhine, the collapse of the Third Reich was becoming increasingly evident with each passing day. Captain Werner Müller, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had been reassigned to shore up the western defences, could barely recognize what remained of Germany's once formidable artillery capabilities. His battery of 10 5 cm howitzers, once meticulously maintained and supplied, now consisted of 4 operational guns with dwindling ammunition stocks. The horses used to move their equipment were emaciated, feed having become nearly as scarce as the fuel that occasionally reached their position. "We fire maybe 20 rounds a day now, when we used to fire hundreds," noted a Wehrmacht artillery log from February 1945. The Americans respond with 10 times that amount. Their shells fall continuously, and we cannot answer. While military fortunes deteriorated, Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine worked at fever pitch. Radio broadcasts and front newspapers warned soldiers about the barbaric treatment awaiting those who surrendered. Special emphasis was placed on the fate of artillerymen, who were told American forces harbored particular hatred for German artillery units that had inflicted significant casualties during the Ardennes offensive. "The enemy gives no quarter to German gunners," declared one leaflet distributed to artillery positions in March 1945. "They have witnessed our effectiveness and seek revenge. Better to die with honor than face American firing squads." These messages found fertile ground among exhausted soldiers who had little access to alternative information. Many had witnessed summary executions on the Eastern Front and projected these experiences onto Western Allied forces. The propaganda carefully conflated Soviet treatment of prisoners with supposed American practices. For the men serving the guns, their military identity was deeply intertwined with their weapons. German artillery had once been the backbone of Wehrmacht operations, the professional pride of men who could deliver devastating firepower with mathematical precision. Now, these same men received orders to prepare demolition charges for their own equipment. "Say, I noticed you've been with us for a while on this historical journey. We'd really appreciate it if you'd hit that subscribe button to join our community of history enthusiasts. Where are you watching from today? Drop a comment below. I always love to see how far these stories of courage and conflict travel. Now let's get back to those final desperate days of the German artillery units. As American forces breached the Siegfried Line and pushed toward the Rhine in early March, Battery D received increasingly desperate orders. Ammunition was to be conserved for only the most critical targets. Maps marked with elaborate defensive fire plans became largely theoretical as the shells required to execute them no longer existed. Fuel shortages meant gun positions could rarely be changed, making the battery vulnerable to American counter-battery fire, which had become devastatingly accurate thanks to aerial observation and radar. The psychological toll mounted as soldiers watched refugees streaming eastward, carrying what possessions they could manage. These civilians brought stories of American tanks appearing suddenly in villages thought to be safely behind German lines. The collapse was not orderly. It was rapidly becoming chaotic. "We are ordered to fight to the last man, but we can see the officers preparing escape routes," wrote one artillery sergeant in a letter never mailed. "They tell us the Americans will kill us if we surrender, but then they burn their documents and hide their insignia." Military discipline began to fray as food rations were cut again. Battery D was down to 1 meal per day by mid-March. Soldiers began to question orders more openly, particularly those that seemed suicidal or pointless. The battery's executive officer was found dead one morning, an apparent suicide, though rumors suggested he had been planning to surrender and was executed as an example. Among the most unsettling directives was the order for all soldiers to destroy personal items that might identify their unit or rank if captured. Particularly troubling was the instruction to dispose of medals and decorations, symbols of honor that many had literally bled to earn. Iron crosses, wound badges, and campaign medals were to be buried or destroyed rather than fall into enemy hands. We were told Americans collected these as souvenirs after executing the owners, recalled one gunner in a post-war interview. I had carried my Iron Cross since Russia. The thought of destroying it seemed like erasing what little remained of my identity as a soldier. As American artillery fire grew closer, the men of Battery D faced the most consequential decision of their military service. Would they obey the final order to fight to the death? Would they attempt to blend with the civilian population? Or would they risk surrender to an enemy they had been told would show no mercy? For Captain Müller and his men, the propaganda-induced fear of American vengeance weighed heavily against the increasingly obvious reality that the war was irretrievably lost. As the sound of American tank engines became audible in the distance, the battery prepared for what many believed would be their final hours. In early April 1945, the 2nd Armored Division, nicknamed Hell on Wheels, pushed eastward through Germany's Weser River Valley. The Americans moved with confidence, their tank columns stretching for miles along rural roads that wound through farmland and forest. For the German artillerymen of the 216th Artillery Regiment, remnants of what had once been part of the formidable Wehrmacht defense, the American advance wasn't just heard, it was felt through the ground itself. Obergefreiter Karl Metzger could tell the Americans were close, his battery of 10. 5 Simpete howitzers had been repositioned 3 times in as many days. The men were exhausted, running on rations cut to a third of normal, and their ammunition reserves had dwindled to less than 50 shells per gun. They received orders by motorcycle courier rather than radio. Their last functioning field radio had gone silent 2 days earlier when its batteries died. "We will fight until the final victory," their Hauptmann had announced during morning formation, reading from a directive that had come directly from high command. The Americans execute German officers and soldiers upon surrender. Better to die with honor than face humiliation and death at enemy hands. The words echoed what they'd been hearing for months through official channels. Reich propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels had personally broadcast warnings about American brutality. Stories circulated of artillery officers being singled out for execution because their long-range weapons had killed American soldiers who never saw their killers. They especially hate artillerymen, was the common belief among the men. They'll shoot us where we stand if we surrender. As dawn broke on April 11th, forward observers reported American reconnaissance units less than 3 kilometers away. The 216th's remaining guns were positioned along a hillside overlooking a strategic crossroads. They had been ordered to delay the American advance long enough for retreating infantry units to reach a defensive position farther east. Around mid-morning, the distinctive sound of Sherman tanks echoed through the valley. American artillery began to drop ranging shots near their position. The German battery responded with carefully targeted counter-battery fire, their experienced gun crews working with mechanical precision despite their exhaustion. By noon, American tanks had appeared at the edge of the village below. The German howitzers fired their remaining armor-piercing rounds, disabling 2 Shermans, whose crews quickly abandoned their burning vehicles. But the Americans kept coming. "That's Task Force B of Combat Command A, 2nd Armored," observed Feldwebel Werner Gruber, who had faced American armor in Normandy. "They'll flank us within the hour. We should withdraw while we can." The Hauptmann shook his head. Orders are to hold until signaled. He checked his watch. Another 40 minutes at minimum. The American advance stalled briefly as they regrouped, but by early afternoon it was clear the position would soon be overrun. The Germans fired their last coordinated barrage as Sherman tanks began to climb the slopes toward their position. "Destroy the firing mechanisms," the Hauptmann ordered finally. "Prepare to withdraw." The men moved quickly, removing breech blocks and sights from the howitzers. Some buried their medals and decorations in small tins, believing they would return someday to retrieve them. Others, following standing orders, smashed photographs of family members to prevent them falling into enemy hands. But it was too late for an orderly retreat. American infantry had already worked their way through the woods on the battery's flank. The first shots came from less than 100 meters away. "We're surrounded," shouted a young gunner. The Hauptmann surveyed the situation, then made the most difficult decision of his military career. "Prepare white flags." Gruber looked at him in disbelief. "Sir, the orders—" "I will not sacrifice these men needlessly," the officer replied. "The war is lost. We've done our duty." They fashioned white flags from undershirts and signal cloths. The Hauptmann instructed his men to place their weapons in a central pile and stand at attention beside their disabled howitzers. As American soldiers emerged from the tree line, weapons trained on the Germans, an overwhelming sense of dread fell over the artillerymen. Many were convinced these would be their final moments. Some closed their eyes, others whispered prayers. The American captain who approached spoke through an interpreter. His men secured the area with practiced efficiency, checking each German for weapons. The Americans were tense, but professional. No shots were fired. The German artillerymen were instructed to sit in rows. Each man was searched thoroughly, but not roughly. When they found Gruber's iron cross in his pocket, the American sergeant examining him held it up to his superior. "Sir, this man has a medal. Protocol?" The American captain glanced at the decoration, then at the German NCO. "Let him keep it." The order was repeated throughout the line as more medals and personal items were discovered. Watches were confiscated, as were knives and compasses. But medals, photographs and personal letters were returned to their owners. Confusion spread among the Germans. This directly contradicted everything they'd been told would happen. One young gunner began to weep silently, overwhelmed by relief. The Hauptmann maintained his composure, but the tight line of his shoulders relaxed slightly. As they were processed, the Americans provided water and basic field rations. A medic attended to a German soldier with a shrapnel wound from earlier fighting. They were treated not as murderers to be executed, but as soldiers who would now become prisoners of war. "You'll be transported to a collection point," the interpreter explained. "From there to a proper POW camp. The war is over for you." The Americans allowed the German officers to retain their sidearms until reaching the collection area, a gesture of professional respect that startled the Wehrmacht men. When they arrived at the designated area, a school gymnasium in a nearby town, they found hundreds of other German soldiers already processed and waiting. It was there that Obergefreiter Metzger first spoke with American soldiers directly. A young GI from Nebraska noticed the ribbon bar on Metzger's uniform. "Eastern Front?" he asked in broken German. Metzger nodded cautiously. The American offered him a cigarette. "Tough fighting there, I heard." This simple acknowledgement, recognition of their combat experience rather than demonization, marked the beginning of a profound realization among the German artillerymen. The enemy they had been taught to fear as brutal executioners were instead treating them according to military convention and basic human dignity. As they settled in for their first night of captivity, the Hauptmann gathered his officers and senior NCOs. "It seems," he said quietly, "that we have been misled about many things." A collection officer began the formal process of registering the POWs, recording names, ranks, and units. When he reached the section about personal possessions, he specifically noted military decorations, ensuring they would remain with their owners during their internment. For men who had been prepared to die rather than surrender, this unexpected preservation of their military honor provided a strange comfort at the moment their war finally ended. In early 1945, a new reality emerged for the thousands of German soldiers surrendering to American forces as the Third Reich collapsed. After years of Nazi propaganda describing Americans as vengeful barbarians who would execute prisoners, many Wehrmacht troops discovered something unexpected, a system of processing that, while strict, was fundamentally humane. "The Americans took our weapons, but let us keep our dignity," recalled former artillery lieutenant Karl Brauer in a 1975 interview preserved at the National W2 Museum. "I was certain they would shoot me when they found my Iron Cross. Instead, the sergeant examining me looked at it, nodded, and moved to the next man." American processing of German POWs followed a carefully structured protocol. Artillery units were particularly valuable intelligence sources, so their officers were typically separated for specialized questioning about fire control methods, ammunition supplies, and communication systems. Enlisted men were processed through collection points established just behind the front lines, where they surrendered weapons, military equipment, and unit documentation. The U.S. Army's adherence to the Geneva Convention stood in stark contrast to the treatment many Allied soldiers received in German captivity. Military police units established temporary holding facilities where prisoners received food, basic medical care, and were registered before transportation to more permanent camps. The Ninth Army alone processed over 200 German prisoners in April 1945, creating a massive logistical challenge that required improvisation and rapid expansion of facilities. "We had planned for prisoners, but not this many, this fast," explained Colonel James Wilkins, who supervised POW operations in the European theater. "Every day brought thousands more. We had to rapidly convert warehouses, fields, even racetracks into temporary holding centers." What surprised many German artillerymen most was the American policy regarding personal possessions. While all military equipment, maps, and documents were confiscated, U.S. forces generally allowed prisoners to keep personal photographs, religious items, and even their military decorations. This practice, rooted partly in pragmatism and partly in respect, made a profound impression on men who had been told Americans would strip them of everything. The decision to allow German soldiers to keep their medals stemmed from several practical considerations. American intelligence officers recognized that forcing the surrender of decorations would create unnecessary resistance and complicate processing. More importantly, the medals themselves held intelligence value. They helped identify elite units and veterans with significant combat experience. "We could tell a lot about a man from his ribbons," explained former Army intelligence officer Robert Thornton. "A soldier with an Eastern Front medal and winter campaign badges was likely at Stalingrad or other major Russian campaigns. That information helped us piece together unit histories and movements." For the German artillery troops, their medals represented years of service, professional identity, and personal sacrifice. The Iron Cross, Artillery Assault Badge, and various campaign medals weren't just decorations, but markers of their military lives. American permission to keep these items profoundly affected how many Germans perceived their captors. The reality of American POW camps further contradicted Nazi propaganda. While conditions were Spartan, with basic rations and limited comforts, they were generally sanitary and safe. German prisoners received standard meals, often better than what civilians in occupied Germany were eating, and medical care according to military standards. Many camps established educational programs, work details, and even recreational activities as the war ended. Transportation to American soil became the next stage for approximately 425 German POWs, including thousands of artillerymen. Converted Liberty ships carried prisoners to the United States, where they were distributed among hundreds of camps spread across 46 states. These American camps would become unexpected windows into American society for men who had been taught to view Americans as enemies. I expected a prison. Instead, we worked on farms, read books, and even played soccer, remembered Heinrich Meyer, who had served in a heavy artillery battalion before his capture in the Ruhr Valley. The farmers would bring us extra food sometimes. I had been told Americans would starve us. The agriculture program became one of the most successful aspects of German POW management in America. With millions of American men overseas, German prisoners provided critical farm labor across the country, working on everything from cotton fields in Arizona to potato farms in Maine. They received payment for their work according to the Geneva Convention, with earnings held in accounts until repatriation. This direct exposure to American society created connections that would have seemed impossible during combat. Farmers in the Midwest found they shared agricultural knowledge with German prisoners who had worked similar lands before the war. In some communities, German POWs with musical training formed bands that performed for both the camps and occasionally for American audiences. Captain William Sherman, who supervised a POW camp in Nebraska, noted in his official reports, "These men came expecting the worst. They leave understanding Americans as people, not propaganda caricatures. This may be the most important outcome of our POW program." The German artillery veterans' experiences as American prisoners planted seeds for post-war reconciliation. Upon repatriation between 1946 and 1947, many returned to a devastated Germany with nuanced views of their former enemies. As the Cold War emerged, West Germany's integration into Western security structures was facilitated by these shared experiences. The medals that American troops allowed German prisoners to keep became physical reminders of this complex history. Many former artillerymen who settled in post-war West Germany would occasionally display these decorations not as symbols of Nazi militarism, but as personal artifacts from their youth, artifacts they still possessed because of unexpected American restraint. By allowing German soldiers to maintain these small symbols of their military service, American forces had unknowingly created powerful ambassadors for post-war cooperation. The artillerymen who had anticipated death at American hands instead brought home stories of pragmatic decency that contradicted years of propaganda. "I kept my artillery badge until my death," wrote former Oberleutnant Werner Schmidt in his 1985 memoir, "not as a celebration of war, but as a reminder that even in our darkest hour, humanity can surprise us. The Americans could have taken everything. Instead, they showed us there might be a path forward." As Germany rebuilt in the post-war years and eventually joined NATO, these shared experiences became part of the foundation for a new relationship between former enemies. The medals that crossed the Atlantic and returned became small but significant bridges between nations, unexpected souvenirs of humanity discovered amid the ruins of war.